The car was still humming when officers arrived, its wheels spinning in the air as if the vehicle itself hadn't yet realized the ride was over. The silver Honda Accord sat wedged against a building, smoke curling upward, glass scattered like jagged confetti across the pavement. Inside, a young woman lay slumped over the wheel, her body riddled with wounds. The windshield bore perfect round holes, each one a violent punctuation mark in a story that should have ended so differently. Neighbors stood frozen on the sidewalk, some clutching their phones after calling 911, others whispering in disbelief. They had heard it all: the rapid succession of gunshots, the scream of tires, the thunderous crash that shook the calm of Guilford College Road. Now, they were staring at the aftermath, too stunned to process that what they had witnessed wasn't an accident, but an execution played out in real time. The victim's name was Juquin Coco Hamilton, 25 years old, a drag performer, a stylist, a daughter, and a friend whose presence was said to light up every room she entered. Her life had been about boldness, authenticity, and color. And yet here she was, silent and still, her final breaths stolen not by fate, but by someone she once loved. To understand how a vibrant young woman's life ended in such violent silence, we have to rewind. We have to step back into the moments when her story still carried laughter, music, and hope. Coco had always been a force of nature. Born in Haiti and brought to the United States as a child, she knew from an early age that she was different and that her difference was her strength. At 11 years old, she told her mother she wanted to transition. Her mother, Toy Nicole Ratliff, recalled the conversation years later, saying, "I will support you." And she did. That affirmation became the foundation on which Coco built her identity. As she grew, Coco found her stage in Greensboro's LGBTQ+ community. Under the name Quanisha Chantel, she performed in drag shows that lit up the night. The crowd loved her not only for her artistry but for her fearlessness. Her style was loud, her laughter contagious, and her authenticity undeniable. She didn't just perform, she inspired. Every hairstyle she crafted, every outfit she wore, was another way of telling the world, "This is who I am." But behind the spotlight, Coco craved something every person wants: love. She wanted to be seen for who she truly was, not as someone's secret, not as someone to hide. It was during this search for connection that she crossed paths with Jeremy Reynolds. Jeremy was, by all outward appearances, an exemplary man. 31 years old, a father, a partner, employed, the kind of person who looked settled and reliable. To the outside world, he was a family man. To Coco, he became something far more complicated. Their relationship started quietly, almost innocently. What began as companionship grew into intimacy, and soon it became a 2-year relationship that neither of them could openly acknowledge. For Coco, those early days must have felt intoxicating. Someone cared for her, someone wanted her. But there was a catch. Jeremy was married. He had a girlfriend living in the same house, and a young daughter. His life was constructed carefully, a public image polished to perfection. And Coco was not part of that image. At first, she accepted the secrecy. Love can be blinding, especially when it fills a void. But slowly, secrecy turned into control. Jeremy didn't want her to post too much on social media. He worried when she performed in drag shows, fearing someone would connect the dots. He pressured her to stay quiet, to keep their relationship locked away. Every smile she shared with the world threatened to unravel the careful life he was desperate to protect. What looked like love from the outside began to feel like a cage from the inside. Coco confided in friends, admitting the weight of being someone's hidden truth was eating at her. She was radiant in public, but in private messages, she revealed the cracks, his jealousy, his demands, his quiet threats, and still, she stayed, hoping maybe one day he would choose honesty. Maybe one day he would claim her, instead of hiding her. But that day never came. Instead, the more Coco leaned toward living freely, the more Jeremy grew desperate to hold her back. His fear of exposure gnawed at him. What would happen if his family knew? What would happen if his community knew? The stakes were high, not because of what Coco demanded, but because of the secret Jeremy refused to face. In the fall of 2024, something shifted. Coco decided she had had enough. After nearly 2 years of being kept in the shadows, she told Jeremy it was over. She wanted out. She wanted to live her life openly, without the burden of someone else's shame weighing her down. That decision was the beginning of the end. On November 10th, she went to his house one last time. Inside, words were exchanged, pleas at first, then anger, then the sharp edge of threats. His girlfriend and young child were there too, inside those walls, unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding. Coco stood her ground. She was done being silent. She stepped outside, keys in hand, sliding into her silver Honda Accord. She turned the ignition. Headlights flared, cutting through the November darkness. She was ready to leave, ready to drive away not just from his house, but from the secrecy and control that had bound her for too long. Jeremy followed. His footsteps thudded against the pavement. In his hand was a gun. Neighbors later said the moment felt like slow motion. Her car rolling forward, his arm raising, the metal of the weapon catching the streetlight. Then came the sound that shattered everything. Gunfire. Coco tried to escape, flooring the gas, but the bullets kept coming. One struck the car, another the windshield, and then her body. Her hands jerked against the steering wheel as the vehicle veered out of control. Within seconds, she was gone. Police would later find shell casings scattered across the road, fingerprints on the weapon, and messages on her phone. Messages showing Jeremy's desperation, his threats, his unraveling grip on the secret he had built his life around. And that night, as emergency lights painted Guilford College Road in red and blue, a haunting question hung in the air. How could a man who claimed to love his daughter, who played the role of a model father, turn so violently against a woman he once called his partner? Was this really about love? Or was it always about fear, control, and a secret he couldn't let live? There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. When police arrived at the crash site that November night, their first priority was the young woman lying lifeless inside the silver Honda. But as paramedics worked in silence, investigators began piecing together the chaos that had just unfolded. Witnesses were everywhere. Some had seen the car lose control. Some had heard the shots, and others pointed directly to a man they claimed ran back toward the nearby apartment complex right after the final gunfire echoed. That man was Jeremy Reynolds. At first, officers weren't sure what to believe. Jeremy was known in his community as a father, a working man, someone steady. But within hours, the story began to change. The shell casings scattered along Guilford College Road matched a gun registered to him. And when detectives knocked on his door later that night, they found him rattled, his face pale, his hands trembling. He didn't deny being there. He couldn't. Too many people had already seen. What he did deny was intent. Jeremy insisted he hadn't planned to kill Coco. He said the argument had gotten out of control, that emotions ran high, that he acted in a split second of panic. But the evidence on Coco's phone told a different story. Investigators pulled her last text messages and social media exchanges. In them, a pattern emerged. Coco had grown tired of the secrecy. She wanted to live her truth, and she wasn't afraid anymore of the consequences. She hinted at ending things permanently, even suggested she might tell others about the relationship. Those words carried power. They weren't threats, at least not in her mind, but for Jeremy, they were a ticking time bomb. For a man who had built his identity around being a partner, a father, a figure of respectability, the thought of exposure terrified him. He worried about his girlfriend, he worried about his daughter, he worried about what his friends, his job, his family might say if they knew the truth. And in that pressure cooker of fear and pride, his relationship with Coco became less about love and more about control. Her messages revealed that control in chilling detail. Jeremy told her not to post too many pictures. He told her not to go to certain clubs. He told her who she could and couldn't talk to. And when she pushed back, his tone shifted, first pleading, then angry, then threatening. Coco's friends later said they could see the weight on her. On stage, she was radiant, larger than life, captivating crowds with her drag performances. But behind closed doors, she confided that she felt trapped, as though the very love she had wanted so badly had become a prison she couldn't escape. The night she died wasn't the first time Jeremy had shown flashes of violence. Court records would reveal past incidents, moments of aggression that hinted at a darker side. But what set this night apart was Coco's final decision. She was done. She wanted freedom. And in that freedom, Jeremy saw his whole world collapsing. Detectives pieced the timeline together carefully. Coco arrived at his home around 7:30 p.m. Neighbors heard arguing, loud voices, doors slamming. She left just before 8, stepping into her Honda Accord. Witnesses saw Jeremy follow her out. And less than 5 minutes later, gunshots rang out across Guilford College Road. When police searched his home, they found the gun hidden but not well enough. Ballistics matched the bullets pulled from Coco's car. And fingerprints? His. It was enough to arrest him. Enough to book him into jail. Enough to shatter the image of the man who had once played the role of exemplary father. But the story didn't end there. As Jeremy sat in a cold interrogation room, his head bowed, investigators pressed him. Why did you do it? Why did you shoot her? Was it love? Was it rage? Or was it fear of losing the double life you worked so hard to keep? Jeremy's answers were evasive, scattered, almost rehearsed. He said he didn't mean to. He said she wouldn't listen. He said she pushed him too far. But for detectives, the truth was clear. This wasn't a moment of blind rage. This was a man cornered by his own lies, desperate to silence the one person who knew the full truth about him. In the days that followed, Coco's mother, Toy, spoke out. Her grief was raw, her voice trembling, but her words carried a fierce clarity. He didn't just kill my child, she said. He killed a spirit, a light. He wanted her silent. But she won't be. Her statement pierced through the noise of speculation, of whispers about their relationship, of judgments cast by those who never truly knew Coco. Toy's words reframed the story. This wasn't just about one man and one woman. It was about shame, secrecy, and the violence that can erupt when someone's truth collides with another's fear. In Greensboro, the community reeled. Vigils were held, candles lit, pictures of Coco plastered across posters that read, "Justice for Coco." Friends spoke of her laughter, her artistry, her bravery in living authentically in a world that too often punishes difference. The tragedy wasn't just that she had been killed, it was that she had been killed by someone she once trusted with her heart. And as the case moved toward trial, another haunting detail emerged. Jeremy's young daughter had been inside the home that night, just steps away from the moment that changed everything. She hadn't seen the shooting, but she had heard the shouting, the crash of the door, the sound of her father's footsteps fading into the night. What would she grow up believing? That her father was a hero? Or that he was a man who let fear turn him into a killer? The questions didn't stop there. For every candle lit at a vigil, for every headline written, the community kept asking, why is it that some men, praised as fathers and partners, choose violence the moment their secrets are threatened? And why must the ones who live bravely like Coco be the ones who pay the highest price? The trial was coming. Jeremy Reynolds would have to face everything he had tried so desperately to hide. But what would happen in that courtroom would stun everyone, even those who thought they already knew how this story would end. There's a lot more to discover, and the truth is darker than anyone could have imagined. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The courtroom was tense on the morning Jeremy Reynolds was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, his head lowered. Cameras lined the back wall, capturing every step he took. To the public, this was no longer just a case of one man and one woman. It was a story of betrayal, secrecy, and the price of living a double life. Across the aisle sat Coco's family. Her mother, Toy Nicole Ratliff, held back tears, her hands clenched together, as if in prayer. Friends from the LGBTQ+ community filled the benches, many dressed in bright colors, Coco's colors as a silent act of defiance against the darkness that had taken her. They wanted the world to remember who she was. Not a victim defined by violence, but a woman who had lived fearlessly, authentically, until the very end. The charges were read aloud. First-degree murder and possession of a firearm by a felon. For Jeremy, it was the unraveling of the image he had fought so hard to protect. He had once been the man who people pointed to as an exemplary father, a role model in his neighborhood. Now, every headline carried words like killer, double life, execution-style shooting. The prosecution wasted no time painting the picture. They laid out the evidence piece by piece. The text messages Coco had saved, the witnesses who heard the shouting, the gun recovered from Jeremy's home with his fingerprints still on it. But what chilled the courtroom most were the words from Coco herself. Her final messages were read aloud, her voice echoing through the courtroom in the form of text on a screen. "I'm done hiding. I won't be your secret anymore." Those words landed like a hammer. The jurors shifted in their seats. The gallery gasped quietly, and Jeremy stared down at the table in front of him. The prosecution argued that this wasn't about love gone wrong. This was about control, about a man who had everything to lose if the truth came out, and who chose to silence the one person who could reveal it. Witnesses followed. Neighbors who saw him chase after her car, friends who testified to Coco's fear in the weeks leading up to her death, and experts who confirmed the ballistics matched his gun. Every detail chipped away at the story Jeremy's defense was trying to tell, because the defense's argument was clear. Jeremy had acted in the heat of passion. They claimed this wasn't premeditated murder, but a tragic mistake. His lawyer painted him as a man overwhelmed by emotions, desperate, cornered by a relationship he didn't know how to end. But the jury wasn't blind. They saw the contradictions. If this was truly a crime of passion, why had he chased her down with a weapon already in hand? If he didn't mean to shoot, why were there multiple rounds fired, striking both her car and her body? Why, after she collapsed behind the wheel, did he run not to help her, but to hide? The prosecutor leaned into those questions with precision. In closing arguments, they told the jury, this was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was a choice, a deliberate choice, to end the life of a woman who refused to be silenced. And then came the testimony that shifted the air in the room. Coco's mother took the stand. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. She spoke about her daughter's courage, about the little girl who told her at 11 years old that she wanted to transition, and the promise she made to always stand by her. She lived her truth, Toy said, tears streaking down her face. She was beautiful, bold, and brave, and she should still be here. The courtroom went silent. Even the defense couldn't shake the weight of a mother's grief. When it was Jeremy's turn to speak, his words fell flat. He apologized, but it sounded hollow, rehearsed. He said he never meant for things to go that far, but how could anyone believe that after the evidence, after the texts, after the gunshots that ripped through the night? The jury didn't deliberate long. Within hours, they returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Jeremy Reynolds, once seen as a father, a partner, a man with a future, was now a convicted killer. The judge's sentence was swift. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As the gavel struck, Coco's family embraced, their sobs mingling with the sound of chairs scraping across the floor. Justice had been delivered, at least in the legal sense, but justice doesn't bring back the dead. Justice doesn't erase the pain of knowing her life ended in such violence. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered with signs that read, "Say her name, Coco." They lit candles. They prayed. They demanded not only justice for her, but change. Change in how society views relationships that live in secrecy. Change in how trans women of color are treated. Change in how love can turn into danger when paired with shame and fear. For Jeremy, prison walls would replace the home he once shared with his girlfriend and child. His daughter would grow up knowing her father not as a role model, but as the man who pulled the trigger. And for Coco, the stage she once lit up now sat empty. Her costumes, her wigs, her laughter all reduced to memories carried by those who loved her. But as the trial closed, one question lingered in the air, unshakable. How many more lives must be lost because someone chose secrecy over truth, control over love, violence over vulnerability? And perhaps the darker question still, was Jeremy's story unique? Or is it only one example of a tragedy that keeps repeating, hidden in plain sight? Because even as Coco's family mourned, another story eerily similar was beginning to surface in a different city, with another man who had too much to hide. And that connection would raise unsettling questions about whether Coco's death was truly an isolated act or part of a far bigger pattern. There's more to come, and it will challenge everything you thought you knew about this case. Don't miss the next installment. Subscribe, so you don't get left behind. The trial may have ended with a guilty verdict, but outside the courtroom, the ripples of Coco's death were only beginning to spread. For her family, grief wasn't just about losing a daughter. It was about the brutal way she was taken, the betrayal that turned someone she loved into her killer. For the community, the shock wasn't only about Jeremy Reynolds' crime, it was about how familiar the story felt, almost as if they had heard it before. Because this wasn't just a case of one man, one woman, one tragedy. It was part of something larger, something far more unsettling. In Greensboro alone, Coco's name joined a devastating list. In recent years, several transgender women of color had been murdered under strikingly similar circumstances. The details changed, different streets, different names, different killers, but the themes were hauntingly constant: secrecy, shame, relationships hidden in the shadows, and violence unleashed when those secrets threatened to come to light. Coco's case forced people to ask, how many more lives had been cut short because someone else couldn't face the truth about who they were and who they loved? Her friends were quick to point out the cruel irony. On stage, Coco was never hidden. Under the name Quanesha Chantel, she was dazzling, unapologetic, impossible to ignore. She performed at drag shows where audiences cheered her every move, where she commanded the spotlight with a confidence many envied. Yet in her personal life, the man she loved demanded she stay invisible. It was that clash between visibility and secrecy that had cost her life. And as vigils were held in her honor, activists in Greensboro and beyond began connecting her story to a larger narrative. They spoke about the dangers transgender women, especially women of color, face when involved with men who live double lives. Men who crave their affection in private but deny them in public. Men who feel trapped between their truth and the image they want to protect. Men who, when cornered, too often choose violence. But the most haunting part of Coco's story was how preventable it felt. Friends later revealed she had voiced her fears before. She worried Jeremy would snap if she left. She admitted he had threatened her, yet, like so many others in her position, she held on to hope that love would win out, that he would change, that leaving quietly would be enough. Her trust, her hope, her bravery, they had all collided with his fear, and in that collision, Coco was erased. The more the community spoke out, the clearer the pattern became. Advocates cited national statistics showing that transgender women of color face disproportionately high rates of violence, with many cases left unsolved or brushed aside. The narrative repeated itself again and again. A hidden relationship, a threatened exposure, and a violent end. Coco's name became a rallying cry. Not because her story was the first, but because it was one more reminder of a problem far too large to ignore. Meanwhile, Jeremy Reynolds sat behind bars, adjusting to life without freedom. His carefully built identity, the exemplary father, the community man, was shattered. But for all his downfall, one fact remained. He was still alive. Coco was not, and this imbalance sparked outrage. Her friends asked, "Why is it always the victim who pays with their life, while the perpetrator gets years, decades, even a lifetime to reflect? Where is the justice in that?" Her mother, Toy, channeled her grief into advocacy. She stood before cameras, telling anyone who would listen about her daughter's courage. She was bold enough to be herself, Toy said, but this world wasn't bold enough to love her back. Her words carried weight, because beneath the individual tragedy was a societal failure, a failure to protect, to listen, to value lives like Coco's before it was too late. And then, as reporters dug deeper, whispers of another case emerged. In a neighboring state, another transgender woman had been killed under eerily similar circumstances, shot by a man who feared his secret would be exposed. The names were different, the cities miles apart, but the storyline was nearly identical. Suddenly, Coco's death felt less like an isolated act and more like a symptom of something systemic. Was this just coincidence? Or was there a pattern of men across the country choosing violence to preserve their public image? The realization sent chills through those following the case. If Coco's killer could be someone praised as a devoted father, how many others were hiding the same secret? How many more women were in danger? Loving men who could turn on them in an instant if exposed. As the community mourned, these questions echoed louder than ever. Why do some men see their secret relationships as something shameful instead of something human? Why does pride so often turn into violence? And how can a society claim to value truth when so many are punished for living openly, while others kill to keep living a lie? Coco's story was heartbreaking enough on its own, but the possibility that her death was one chapter in a much larger, ongoing tragedy made it even more haunting. And as the world began to ask those questions, another revelation surfaced, one that would drag this story into even darker territory. Because someone close to Jeremy claimed he hadn't just threatened Coco. He had spoken before about what he would do if she ever exposed him. And those words suggested something chilling. That her death may not have been as spontaneous as he claimed. That maybe, just maybe, he had planned it all along. There's more to come, and the next part of this story might just change the way you see things. Don't miss the next part. Subscribe so you don't miss out. For months, Jeremy Reynolds insisted he hadn't planned to kill Coco. His defense hinged on the story that it was all a tragic mistake, a crime of passion. He said the argument got heated, that he snapped in the moment. But as investigators kept digging, cracks in that story grew wider, and soon, they uncovered details that suggested something far more disturbing. It started with testimony from people close to Jeremy. Friends, acquaintances, even those who knew him casually, began recalling comments he had made in the past. Offhand remarks at cookouts, whispers in private conversations, words that seemed meaningless at the time but now, in hindsight, painted a chilling picture. One acquaintance came forward and told investigators Jeremy once said, "If she ever tried to ruin my life, I'd handle it. I'd take care of it myself." Another remembered him saying he couldn't let anyone find out about his relationship with Coco, that it would destroy everything. Those weren't the words of a man caught off guard. They were the words of someone who had thought about what exposure might mean and what he might do to stop it. Even more damning were Coco's own accounts. In the weeks before her death, she confided in friends that Jeremy had threatened her. She admitted she was scared but also exhausted from the secrecy. She was tired of hiding, tired of living on his terms. Some of those friends later told police she felt like she was in danger if she left him. And then there were the text messages. Beyond the ones already revealed in court, investigators recovered deleted threads from Coco's phone messages, where Jeremy warned her not to push him, where he hinted that walking away wouldn't be so simple. Piece by piece, the evidence suggested this wasn't a sudden eruption of rage. It was a pressure cooker, years in the making, with Jeremy quietly preparing for the possibility that Coco might one day walk away and expose the secret he couldn't bear the world to see. The thought that her death might have been premeditated shook everyone who had followed the case. It meant that on that November night, when he grabbed his gun and followed her out the door, Jeremy may not have been acting impulsively. He may have been carrying out an unspoken plan, and that possibility reopened wounds for Coco's family. Her mother, Toy, told reporters she had long feared Jeremy would hurt her daughter. She trusted him, Toy said, but I could see the danger in his eyes when she talked about leaving. The more the family reflected, the more signs they recognized in hindsight the way Coco had grown quieter in recent months. The tension that followed her whenever she mentioned his name, the unease that seemed to shadow her even when she was smiling. To them, the premeditation theory wasn't just plausible, it felt inevitable. For prosecutors, the new revelations strengthened the argument they had made all along. This was no accident. This was a calculated act by a man who couldn't stomach the thought of his double life unraveling. But what disturbed many observers most wasn't only that Jeremy may have planned it. It was the cold reality that Coco herself had seen it coming. She had predicted the danger, warned her friends, and still ended up exactly where she feared she might. That truth made her story resonate even deeper. How many other women, they wondered, were living with the same fears? How many more were loving men who swore to protect them in private but would rather kill them than be exposed in public? Meanwhile, Jeremy sat in prison, stripped of the image he had once projected. In his silence, people were left to imagine what went through his mind that night. Did he convince himself he had no choice? Did he weigh the cost of her life against the cost of his secret? Or had the decision already been made long before Coco stepped into her car? For Coco's friends, the details hardly mattered. What they knew was that their friend had been vibrant, bold, and brave, and she had been betrayed by someone who claimed to care for her. What they knew was that her life had been stolen, and no explanation would ever bring her back. Her death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder of the deadly consequences when love is twisted by fear, shame, and secrecy. And yet, as the world processed these revelations, another layer of the story began to surface. One that reached beyond Jeremy and Coco, because buried in police reports and whispered through the community were suggestions that Coco might not have been the only one, that Jeremy had been involved in other hidden relationships, that Coco's was not the first life he had threatened. And if that was true, then the story was darker than anyone realized. Could it be that Jeremy's violence wasn't an isolated act of desperation, but part of a pattern? One that stretched further than anyone dared imagine? That question would ignite the final, most unsettling chapter of this case. We'll be faced with the possibility that Coco's death was not just about one man's secret. It was also a mirror of something deeply broken in society itself. There's one final twist to this story that you won't see coming. Subscribe so you don't miss the ending. In the courtroom, as the trial came to its close, silence hung like a storm cloud. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, carrying the weight of weeks of testimony, evidence, and the haunting image of a young woman whose life had been stolen. When the foreperson finally stood to deliver the verdict, Coco's family held their breath, clutching each other's hands as if bracing for impact. Guilty. The word rang out like thunder. Jeremy Reynolds, the man who had once called himself a father, a protector, a man of God, was now convicted as a murderer. The mask he had worn for years shattered in that moment, leaving only the truth. A man who chose his reputation over a human life. For Coco's family, the verdict brought a measure of relief. Justice had spoken. But as her mother, Toy, later said, "Justice doesn't bring her back. I still go to sleep every night knowing my baby is gone." As reporters covered the trial's conclusion, the story spread beyond Greensboro. Advocates for transgender rights, domestic violence survivors, and community leaders seized on Coco's case as a rallying cry. They pointed to her death as a tragic example of what happens when stigma, secrecy, and shame collide with violence. Because Coco's story wasn't just about one relationship gone wrong. It was about a culture that made Jeremy feel he had to hide, that his image was worth more than her life. It was about the silence Coco endured, the fear she carried, and the way society often turns away from women like her until it's too late. Her death forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. How many others were living in the shadows, afraid that loving someone openly could cost them everything? How many more would pay the price for secrets that should never have been shameful in the first place? In the weeks after the trial, vigils were held in Coco's honor. Candles flickered in the night as friends and strangers gathered to speak her name, to remember her laughter, her boldness, her dreams. They refused to let her story end in silence. Her mother stood before the crowd, her voice breaking but steady. Coco was love. She was light. And she deserved to live. If her story can save even one more life, then her spirit will keep shining. Those words carried across the community, reminding everyone that behind the headlines, behind the courtroom drama, there was a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who mattered. And yet, even as people mourned, whispers continued. Rumors that Jeremy's double life had stretched further than anyone knew, that Coco wasn't the only woman he had hidden, or the only one he had threatened when secrecy hung in the balance. Investigators never confirmed those stories, but the possibility lingered like a shadow. If true, it meant Coco's death was not just a single act of desperation but part of a pattern, one that might have eventually claimed even more lives. The thought chilled those who followed the case, because it suggested that what happened to Coco wasn't inevitable, it was preventable. If someone had listened sooner, if someone had spoken louder, maybe she would still be here. Today, Jeremy Reynolds sits behind bars, stripped of the image he built, left only with the choices he made. He traded a lifetime of freedom for a single night of violence. He silenced Coco's voice, but in doing so, he amplified her story to the world. Coco's name now lives on in advocacy groups, in conversations about love, safety, and acceptance. Her story is told not just as a tragedy, but as a call to action, because until the stigma is broken, until secrets are no longer treated as shameful, more lives will be at risk. And that is the haunting lesson of this case, that silence can be deadly, that secrecy can destroy, and that love should never have to hide. As we close this story, we return to the question that has echoed since the night Coco lost her life. What matters more, a reputation or a human life? Jeremy Reynolds made his choice. But it's up to us, as a society, to make a different one. To choose compassion over judgment, truth over shame, life over silence. Because somewhere, right now, there's another Coco laughing with her friends, dreaming of tomorrow while living in fear that her love could cost her everything. The question is, will her story end differently? That answer depends on all of us.